the DAWbench Radio Show, the official podcast of DAWbench.com.
Welcome to the DAWbench Radio Show. I am your host, Vin Curigliano of AAVIM Technology in Melbourne, Australia, and I am joined again by my co-host, Pete Brown of Microsoft in Maryland in the United States. How you going, Pete?
Doing really well, Vin. Although I'm really jealous. I know we always talk about weather at the beginning of these, but I heard about some really nice weather from somebody here just 5 minutes ago, and I'm super jealous right now.
Well, you know, hey, look, I'm in the middle of summer, but it feels like winter, but that's typical Melbourne. so, you know, 4 seasons in a day.
Right.
Now, today, we have a very special guest, and that is Marcus Ryle, who has been on the front line of music tech innovation for well over 4 decades, and has been directly involved in development of many iconic products, including the Oberheim Expander, Alesis ADAT, and the Line 6 modeled guitar amp products. Now, that's just 3 that I cherry-picked, because there's a lot more.
Wow.
Welcome, Marcus.
Hey, Vin. Hey, Pete. Happy to be here.
Mate, we're very happy that you're here, and thank you very much for actually agreeing to come on the show.
My pleasure.
Awesome. Now, your history, I mean, I've been doing quite a bit of research, and there's a lot of history to go through, Marcus, let me tell you. And you're quite unique in comparison to the other music tech pioneers that I've had on the show, simply in the sense that your body of work isn't reserved to one brand, with your company Fast Forward Design, which was essentially a design and engineering consultancy firm. The best way to describe it, you became hired guns for the industry, and designed an amazing array of products. And the more I was researching, the more I realized that there was just so many products that I had either owned, used, or were very, very familiar with, that you had been directly involved in the design and engineering. And look, it's quite amazing. So I think, the good way to start the show would be if you can give us your personal history in music and technology and how that led you to your first job with Tom Oberheim, which is, an amazing first job in anyone's book.
Yeah, it certainly was. I think it starts out with a pretty set of lucky circumstances, being born in Los Angeles and having very supportive and talented parents, exposing me to a lot of music and technology, frankly, from a very early age. My mom's family had quite a musical background, and my dad's was very much focused on technology. He was an innovator in the computer world and things like that. So I got exposed to things from a real early age, and started taking classical piano when I turned 7, and was studying piano for about 10 years. But probably around age 9 or 10, I heard my first synthesizer record because of a record called Moog by Dick Hyman that my dad had brought home. And that just blew my mind to hear these sounds I'd never heard before. And I feel like that kind of set everything in motion. So from that point on, I've just kind of been obsessed with music and technology.
Yeah, awesome. Now, the story of how you first met Tom and started working for Oberheim is an interesting one. Can you share that with us, please?
Yeah. I was 18, and I'd been at Cal State Dominguez Hills a couple of years. I'd left high school when I turned 16 because it wasn't my thing.
Right.
And at Cal State Dominguez Hills, they had a synthesizer lab and a recording studio with a 16-track 2-inch 3M machine. So it was like I was a kid in a candy store. I spent pretty much day and night there. And because all of those things were new, it's all stuff that we consider vintage today. This was pretty state-of-the-art for its time, and the school was somewhat understaffed. So I started teaching labs, and we had acquired a synclavier, the only one on the West Coast. There's a whole long story associated with that, but I actually was teaching a class on programming the synclavier because I'd convinced New England Digital to send me the source code in XML,
Right.
so we could modify it and just make it do things it wasn't designed to do. And Tom Oberheim got wind of this being down there, and he came down and gave a guest lecture for a class, and also wanted to see the synclavier. So I gave him a demo, just showed him the thing, and it never even occurred to me that I should be looking for a real job, because at that point I was sure I was still had a shot at, being a rock star or something, or working in studios. And so it was a pleasant surprise when Tom offered me a job, and I had just turned 19 by then.
Wow.
And it's kind of funny. It was so that was a big crossroads moment, of which some of the gear freaks will relate. The pivot point was when I asked Tom, well, if I joined the company, could I have an OBX?
Yeah.
and he said, well, sure. Well, he said we'd kind of give you one on permanent loan. And I said, well, then, yeah, I think I want the job. So, because certainly, in 1980, at 19 years old, there's no way I would have ever been able to afford an OBX. So that was quite luxurious.
Right. That's like the first signing bonus I've heard of. So yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was pretty big. They pretty much didn't have to pay me. And frankly, they didn't pay me very much at the beginning anyway. But having that OBX was heaven.
Yeah, awesome. And what was the first product that you worked on at Oberheim? Can you remember?
Yeah, I guess technically the OBXA was in development, so I did contribute some to that design, but most of that work was done by Tom and Jim Cooper.
Mm-hmm.
The first product that was kind of on my own was the DSX, which was the polyphonic sequencer.
Right.
This was the pre-MIDI days, so this was connected through a 37-pin cable to an OBX or XA at the time, and it was a multi-track polyphonic sequencer with quantizing. Basically, it was my wish list of everything I wanted a sequencer to be, and they let me go and do it.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And you mentioned the interconnectivity as well. So the Oberheim had something that was pre-MIDI that connected those three instruments.
Yeah.
So that was that unique? That was pretty unique in the industry, wasn't it?
Well, there was. It's interesting when you look back. You can see that a lot of companies kind of were thinking along similar lines, but had their own version. It's kind of like in the early days of videotape, you had VHS and beta, and the concept started to be universal, this notion of being able to control things. Roland, around the same time, had what's it called, a D-Bus?
Yeah, DCB, I think it was. Was that the one?
DCB? Yeah, that's how, you're probably right. So Jim and Tom had the foresight in 1980. They put on the OBXA, and then a retrofit on the OBX, this 37-pin connector. Now, frankly, the design is not something you'd get away with today. It wasn't even designed necessarily with a sequencer in mind. It was the entire microprocessor bus put out on a ribbon cable, so that you basically could take over the whole brain of the synthesizer externally, because that theoretically provided you the most flexibility. You could do anything you wanted with it.
Mm-hmm.
But the first thing that came to mind, obviously, was we could do a sequencer. And there's some fun aspects of how that worked. And when you hooked up the DSX to the OBXA or OBX and later the OB8, the synthesizer didn't even know anything was connected to it. Basically, the sequencer would very briefly put the synthesizer processor to sleep and force into its memory essentially key presses.
Right.
So, and then the synthesizer would wake up and it didn't know the difference between the DSX, telling it that a key was pressed than if you played it yourself. So it was kind of archaic, but it worked, and it was a great learning experience to have it was really the first time you had a sequencer, a drum machine, and synthesizer all synchronized together.
Yeah.
The drum machine being the DMX, which just connected with a single 1/4-inch cable, and that was to have the 96 PPQ clock daisy chain from the sequencer to drum machine.
That bus is super clever. I never realized that was the approach that you all were using at the time.
Yeah, it's interesting because basically there was no need to develop any kind of protocol or communication or handshake. It was just, here's the entire memory map. I mean, in theory, the DSX could, light any light or change any parameter or do anything it wanted with the synthesizer because it could take that over. Actually, there's a clever guy in Germany, and his name escapes me right now. I apologize. Someone could look it up. Who reversed engineered that bus and makes a MIDI interface. It's kind of a MIDI to 37-pin adapter for the OBXA, OBX, and OBSX, since those were pre-MIDI synths. And it's pretty clever. He basically figured out how to kind of do that same thing, but build it all into a little tiny box so you can actually play those synths from MIDI without having to modify the synth.
Yeah. Hey, I've got a question. The sequencer and the drum machine, did they end up getting MIDI directly from the factory, or they would just remain with a proprietary protocol?
The DMX did get a factory MIDI.
Yep.
And the OB8, which was the last of the OB series that came out in '83, that one had it didn't ship initially with MIDI, but it had an factory upgrade with MIDI, and then eventually shipped with MIDI. The DSX never got MIDI directly, but the last software update I did for it allowed you to, since the DSX was a 16 voice sequencer and the OB8 has 8 voices, the other 8 voices came out of CV and gates on the DSX, but the last version of software let you route that out the MIDI output of the OB8. So the OB8's MIDI kind of became the MIDI output for the DSX.
For the sequencer, yeah.
Yeah.
The guy that, or the person that you're thinking of in Germany, it looks like it's MIDIsoft. They make something called the Magic, what's it called? The Magic Box.
There you go. That's the one.
And you're right. They reverse engineered the whole thing, packaged it up, and there you go.
The Magic Box.
Yeah, it's pretty clever.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's great because it's just a way, you could take any of those old synths and have MIDI without even having to open it up. So that's kind of cool.
Yeah, yeah. Look, we've got a fellow here in Australia called Robin Whittle that was doing MIDI retrofits into early analog synthesizers back in the 80s.
That's great.
So I had a Jupiter 8 with MIDI, and his was, his first MIDI thing was kind of pretty primitive, but I had full MIDI, not patch saving by MIDI, that was still by tape, but I had, the note on, note off. I had 4 banks of memory, and I had a cross modulation mod on it. It was awesome. And then someone else did a full MIDI retrofit for Jupiter 8 back in the day, but it wouldn't accept it in mine because I had a really early JP8.
Right.
For some reason, the EEPROMs just would not work with that that later MIDI. So I sold that on to someone else, and I was pretty happy with mine with just the rudimentary one. Now, moving on with the Oberheim stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Look, I love the OBXA and the OB8. I never owned one. I mean, it was pretty difficult to own multiple huge polyphonic synths back in the early 80s. I had my Jupiter 8, which is, we've discussed this with Pete numerous times, it cost as much as a car, So I had my Jupiter 8, but I was lucky enough that I had other band members that had OBXAs and OB8s. Now, they were guitarists, but, they had these poly synths.
Yeah.
I wasn't complaining. I mean, I had access to those and the Prophet 5s. It was kind of awesome. So
that's great.
Very, very familiar with those 2 synthesizers. Now, I've got a quick question because with the chips that were being used with those early Oberheims, were they the solid-state music chips as well? And then you made a move?
No.
No? Okay.
Yeah, no, there was never none of the original Oberheims ever used any of the SSM chips.
Right.
Which, I mean, they were perfectly fine chips. I think most famously it was used in the early Prophets.
Yes.
But the OBX, the first of the OB series, was completely discrete.
Right.
It used basically the same voice design as the SEM and the 2-voice, 4-voice, 8-voice.
Yes.
From the 70s. So it was discrete, and with Curtis chips just for the envelopes. And then the OBXA onward, the oscillators and filters were also Curtis chips.
So that was the change at OBXA. Okay, so that was the question. So I was trying to think, when did you guys go with the Curtis chips? Because I do remember in passing in a discussion between yourself and Dave Smith, there was an interview that I was watching, and the discussion was that you guys were using the same synthesizer chips, essentially,
right?
But the synth sounded completely different,
right.
which is what makes them unique, which is kind of awesome. Now, with the Oberheim stuff, some of my favorite Oberheim instruments came a little bit later, and I'd say you would have been in the front line with some of these. The Oberheim Expander, that just blew my mind when I first got in front of one of those.
Oh, thanks. That's still a favorite.
Can you tell us a bit about the development of that? Because that was, the modulation matrix on that was so far ahead of anyone else at the time. So can you give us some background on that one?
Sure. So the origin really was to just try to make a keyboardless synthesizer. Again, this was before MIDI when we started the design. Obviously, MIDI came out during the design, so the expander that was added to it.
Yes.
But at the beginning, it was, as I mentioned, the DSX had CV and gate outs, so the notion of making a multi-timbral analog synth module that you could hook up to these CV and gates would really expand the Oberheim system. And the first approach we took to it was just to use the same kind of architecture we'd been using. We took, it was actually four OBXA voice boards, and made a new control board prototype so that each could be separately programmable. And we actually showed this at one NAMM show in probably 82 or so. Mm-hmm. And it kind of looked like an OBXA with the keyboard cut off.
Right.
Fortunately, we ran into a real bad technical problem, which is the processor we were using at the time, the Z80. It really started to get bogged down doing 4 voices independently, right? So if you think about the OBX was up to 8 voices, but they all had the same sound. So you could share control voltages for a lot of the signals. The OBXA was now, duophonic or duo timbral, and that you could have 4 voices have a different sound than the other 4 voices. So some of those CVs got doubled. Well, even though the new expander only had 4 voices, we doubled again the number of independent control voltages we needed in order to have each voice be independent. And the processor the whole system just got slow enough that it just felt like this was not going to be very usable. I mean, we did make one working prototype. And by the way, that prototype I got working again a few years ago, and it's now at EMEAP out in Philadelphia. So if anyone cares to see the one OB expander, as we called it, because it was an OB family. But so we had a big problem. It's like, this just doesn't work. We still want to do this. So Michel Douadic, who's a great engineer that I worked together with for many decades, since he's through a lot of the other history too. He and I both had a real love for modular synths, and in particular loved the elegance of the EMS matrix modulation, the pin matrix, the fact that you could so easily understand that you could kind of patch anything to anything. Mm-hmm. So this idea of matrix modulation came up, and we said, well, we clearly need a better processor and a new approach. So we kind of just started with a clean sheet of paper, said, well, let's just design something from scratch. We collaborated with Doug Curtis, who designed some new chips that could do the things we wanted it to do. And we picked a 6809 processor for anyone into old processors. that actually the expander had two processors, one just dedicated to managing the 6 voices and doing the software envelopes and LFOs and so on in modulation matrix, and one that was responsible for the user interface and MIDI and things like that. So yeah, it was a great time because it was basically all about being able to design the dream synth that we wanted. And it's still a favorite. And that it was always intended to be something where the 6-voice board essentially could be used in a modular approach for future synths. So the Matrix 12, where we finally actually used the name Matrix, which is kind of how we described its functionality, just had 2 of those voice boards from the expander, plus circuitry to do the velocity keyboard and so on.
Yep. And the Matrix 6 was essentially an expander and a keyboard, or was it not?
No, the Matrix 6, the main goal of the Matrix 6, you remember at that time, there were some more affordable synths coming out. Sequential was early on with the Prophet 600.
Yep.
And then, Poly 6 and things like that. So it was really about trying to make a more affordable Oberheim. So the oscillators in the Matrix 6 are actually digital,
right.
DCOs.
Yes.
Which are perfectly acceptable, frankly. It's not a giant sonic difference, but there is a sonic difference. But that helped reduce the cost. And of course, the user interface was simplified as much as possible, which did mean you had the dreaded 1 parameter at a time, which the DX7 kind of pioneered. Yeah. But that is a good way to reduce cost. And so and it was a different Curtis chip. Doug had designed a chip that combined some of the functions. Basically, you could have 1 chip per voice once the oscillators were digital to do the filters and VCAs.
And it was a little slower too, I think, right? Like the processing power was reduced in that compared to like the Matrix 12 or something.
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I would have, the Matrix 6 was almost finished when I left, but I didn't see it through to the end. And so I don't have any timing numbers, but my recollection, I would think it would have still been a 6809 processor. I guess the challenge is it was probably 1 processor to be both the UI and MIDI as well as control the voices.
Right.
So it might have been a little slower.
Yeah.
Yeah. That one, the Matrix 12 is still one of my dream synths that I hope someday to be able to get a hold of.
Don't start, Pete.
But I still have mine. I can't part with it.
Oh, yeah. So that's another that's one question I wanted to ask you, because myself and Pete have both brought up the Matrix 12. This is my unicorn synth that I've never been able to get a hold of. And the only time I've ever seen one, Marcus, I was living in Los Angeles in 1989. I just had like an extended summer over there, and I had some spare money, and I was buying up some equipment while I was over there, and I bought an Emax SE, and I bought some early Kurzweil stuff. But the Matrix 12 was the one that I was hunting around for, and I did see one, and I can't remember the price. Even in 1989 was like $6K, and I've gone $7K. I've gone, we've got $6 or $7K, so it slipped my grasp. I didn't have the money, and the only time I've ever known of one in Australia, and there's probably a few more, but they're well hidden. It was one of my friends owned one. And it was a pride and place in the studio, and then the studio got robbed. And when I say robbed, it got cleaned out. And this Matrix 12 was one of the things that got stolen. It has never resurfaced, Marcus. So
that's terrible.
So you want to talk about a unicorn? That was the only one I knew of in Australia, and it got stolen and disappeared. Probably ended up in a container and shipped for sure, because none of that studio actually resurfaced in the So it was a terrible loss.
Yeah.
Vin, back then, you had to have some real muscle to be able to clean out a studio, though. These synths all weighed about 800 pounds each. So.
Oh, yeah, there was more than just a synth, mate. I mean, this was very calculated, and they knew he was overseas, and that they literally cleaned it out. Now, so have you got any idea how many of those were made, Mark? So you don't have to have an exact number.
That's a good question. So it started shipping just at the beginning of 1985. I left in April of 85. And by that time, I think we were probably making about 50 a month or so.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And that's my guess, as I recall. I don't know how many went beyond then. And of course, Oberheim had to file for bankruptcy in May of 85. They continued to make those synths for a while. And then when Gibson took over in, I think, 88, they attempted to move production of the expander Matrix 12 to Japan. And that's there's no technical reason why that should be any problem. However, for reasons I don't know since I wasn't there, someone decided to make some changes. The circuit boards are actually different.
Oh.
Maybe it was component availability. I don't know the history of that, but I do know, sadly, that if you get one of the Japanese-built expanders or Matrix 12s, they are they do seem to have a lot more problems and are much more difficult to repair because I don't think there's much documentation on what was changed. So you could tell there's three vintages of the units of both expanders and Matrix 12s. There's the ones that'll just say Oberheim Electronics Inc. on the serial tag, and that's before May of 85. And then there's others where the serial tag's the same, but they've either punched out or blacked out Oberheim Electronics because that company was bankrupt, and now Oberheim was a brand that was a division of ECC.
Right.
So it was still made in America, still made by the same people, and still decent quality, but then it's after May of 85. And then the Japanese ones will say the serial tag is riveted on and it's no longer, I'm sure somewhere it has to say made in Japan, but there's some other differences. You can see pictures online. The jacks look different and some things like that. You're able to tell the difference.
Very interesting. Hey, I've got one quick question. You may not be able to answer it, but I mean, whatever was happening in that middle 80s with some of the major synth manufacturers, I had the discussion with Dave on his show, and he was saying that they basically moved into a computer card. They were looking at computer peripheral technology probably a little bit too early, and they invested too much time in there, and that kind of tripped them up. Was there anything similar happening with Oberheim? Or, because from my understanding, you were selling everything that you could build.
Yeah. 1984 was the biggest year ever of Oberheim. I think we'd had a few, I think we'd had $1 million month or something. I mean, it was decent business. But I do believe that there is a common thread. Each has their own story, and the details are important. But quite honestly, it's a good reminder that you can be brilliant with product and with knowing what the customer wants and technology and all those other things, but it doesn't take much to go wrong if you're not also brilliant with business,
right,
to find yourself upside down.
Yeah.
And in the case of Oberheim, the Matrix 12, and maybe I'm partly to blame, the Matrix 12 shipped a couple months later than expected. And there were, but there was already parts in inventory to be building them. And then the people supplying the parts want to get paid. And if you've already kind of overextended yourself, basically it's just a classic problem in companies that they don't. Entrepreneurs in particular they're entrepreneurs because they're optimistic, and they can often underestimate how much capital it really takes to safely run a business.
Yep.
So if you've borrowed money from the bank to pay for all this inventory, and then you have a little too much inventory, you can get out of compliance with the bank. And if the bank chooses to, you can foreclose.
Yeah.
Now, the Oberheim case is more complicated because, sadly, Tom was given some advice from some people that he thought were looking after his best interests, but they really weren't. So he was, he was led to believe that it was kind of his only option. was to just allow the company to go into bankruptcy, and then these same advisors bought the assets from the bank. So it was kind of basically taken out from under him, and he may have been a little naive business wise, but it didn't have to happen. I think in Oberheim's case, had he been able to get some really good business advice, nowadays you'd figure out how to solve that problem. So it's sad.
It is quite sad.
Yeah.
So that was now you moved on in 1985.
Yep. April 19th, 1985.
Well, there you go.
5 weeks before the bankruptcy, so I can't claim any responsibility.
Wow, Nostradamus. Yeah, you had a bit of a canary in a coal mine thing happening there.
Well, I laugh about it because I honestly had no idea. I mean, I had just turned 24. It's not like I had some great business experience or anything. I had a wonderful time at Oberheim. It was a great education, but it felt like the company was under strain. I was doing a lot of session work. I was playing with my bands, and I, talked it over with my wife, who's also been my business partner, and it just seemed like time to move on. And I had a very pleasant conversation with Tom that just, thanks so much. I think it's time for me to move on. And I had no idea what I was going to do next. But my timing ended up being pretty lucky.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. And that's when you co-founded Fast Forward Designs. Now, this story has fascinated me, Marcus, because the more I dived in, I've just gone, I mean, that was a touch of brilliance in the sense that you guys are brilliant design engineers, but you just hired yourself out to the other company. So can you tell us that the thought process behind what you did, and then cover some of the products and the companies that you worked with Fast Forward?
Sure.
Yep.
The origin, again, it's I've been accused of leading a charmed life. So this will sound a little unbelievable because believe it or not, there was no great plan that led to this happening. I left on April 19th. A few days later, I get a call from Jafar, who with Woody Moran, those were two ex-Oberheim sales guys. They had started a company called Europa Technologies, and they were distributing products. You have to remember, back at that time, the dollar was pretty strong, and importing products from Europe made sense. They were, I don't know if they already were or about to. They were the distributor of PPG in the U.S. and Dynacord.
Right.
And literally the week after I left, there were some executives from Dynacord visiting in Los Angeles, and Dynacord had made one drum product called the Percuter, very strange name, but it had little drum cartridges, and you could trigger from pads. And they decided they wanted to, do something bigger. And Joff and Woody had said they really need a better sense of the U.S. market. And Joff somehow got wind that I'd left, and he called me up and asked if I could meet with these guys. And Michel Douadic, who's the engineer that I had partnered with, he started Oberheim actually only about 4 or 5 months after I did in 1980. So we collaborated on, obviously, OB8, Expander, Matrix 12, and so on. Mm-hmm. He quit a week after I did.
Right. Okay.
I called him up. I go, there's this company, you want to meet with these guys. So they explained they wanted to do a really advanced digital drum set, and asked if we could do it. And so we, of course, said, sure. But I said, this is maybe when I discovered I did have some natural talent for negotiation and business, because I said to them, well, we don't have anything. We've both just left our jobs, and we'd have to give you a proposal. So why don't you pay us to develop a proposal for you?
Right.
And they said, sure. Oh yeah, I think I said, $5,000. We'll write a proposal, and in 4 weeks you can fly us over to Germany, and we'll present our proposal of what we can do. And
nice.
My wife she's not an engineer, but she fortunately has great talent in everything else related to business. So she quickly, she actually named the company Fast Forward Designs.
Right.
And she found a little office for us and, set up the company and did all the business side. And meanwhile, Michelle and I put our heads down and tried to dream up what we thought a new digital drum set could be. And flew over to Germany and told them, here's what we want to do, which is a product that came out the following year called the AD1 or ADD1, Advanced Digital Drums 1.
Yep. And what year was that, Marcus? Can you remember?
That launched in '86. There's just the
Right.
next year. In fact, we started the company. You think about this. This would be, we met with them in May. We flew over there in June, and by February of the next year, we showed a fully functioning
Wow.
unit and launched at the show. My favorite part of the story, though, for those who might be listening and curious about some business advice, so now we're in Germany. We say, this is what we can do. And now they're like, well, okay, great. We'd like you to do it. How do we do that? So now you have to come up with what's our business proposal? So again, I said, look, we're two guys that have nothing. So first, we're engineers that can do it, but if we don't deliver what we promise, you're just going to have to take that risk because, if you could sue us, but we don't have anything. And if you decide to take advantage of us, you're a giant company and we don't have anything. So we have to start with a basic foundation of trust. So let's make sure we're really clear on expectations. And we can have as short or long a contract you want. That doesn't matter to us as long as we're really clear on expectations. But we have to start with some trust. And second, since we have nothing, I basically gave them a laundry list of development equipment. It was actually, I probably still have the list somewhere. It's probably about $60,000 worth of equipment. HP 64,000 microprocessor development system, a little plotter, a Mac, we have to lay out circuit boards. We said, look, here's all the equipment we need, oscilloscopes, meters. You guys can own it, but we'll use it, but you have to pay for it. And we need a monthly development fee, and we want to get a royalty on the products.
Right.
With the basic, and the basic notion there, which I still believe to this day, is you don't want to just have hired guns. You want people who are truly invested in the success of the product. And we simply explained, if you're cutting us giant royalty checks, that means you are making a ton of money because you're selling a lot of product.
Mm-hmm.
So our upside is all based on this product being successful. So we're going to have a shared goal here. Let's make a great product. And they just said okay to all of it. So we were in business, in the black without putting a penny in from day one. And from our lessons from Oberheim, by our goal, Michelle and I, we basically said, look, we love designing products. We'd love to design more types of products than just we do at Oberheim. But if we don't deal with manufacturing and sales and marketing, we have no overhead. So we have none of the financial risk we had just witnessed at Oberheim.
Yep.
Right.
Perfect.
And Sequential went through later, and Roger Lynn and Bob Moog and Alan R. Perlman. I mean, all of them. It's so sad. They all went through these difficult times in that era. So we just said, well, we don't have to have any financial risk, but we still get to design products, which is what we love to do.
Yeah, brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. And after Dynacord, the next company, well, maybe not the next company, but one of the companies that you did a lot of products for was Alesis. Now,
That was the next company.
it was the next company.
And it's funny, it kind of derailed. Well, so we did the Dynacord product, and despite our fears about inventory and things like that, we did want to try to go at making our own products, but we wanted to do it in as safe a way as financially as possible. So there actually was only one product ever designed that actually says Fast Forward Designs on it.
Right.
And that's called the MIDI Step. And it's a set of MIDI bass pedals that shipped, I believe it might have been the same year as the Dynacord stuff, 86 or 87.
Right.
And it was very simple. It was 1 octave bass pedals with a MIDI out and some features on it. You could, change octaves or do hold and things like that. And it was a calculated move in that we thought there's a need because it doesn't exist, but we also saw that it's never going to be such a big business that all the big companies would try to jump in and compete because it's just not important enough.
No. And how many people could play it? I mean, Geddy Lee,
right.
Apart from Geddy Lee.
Exactly.
I don't know anyone.
That might have been part of the inspiration because I had to wire up the bass pedals for Geddy Lee's OBXA.
Oh, really?
So I remember, those days.
Awesome.
Yeah. But so the bass pedals came out, and we set up an arrangement with a manufacturer in Japan because it was still affordable to make things in Japan back then.
Yep.
And we're able to finance it so that, the product was being paid for as it sold through. So we basically kind of were able to keep all the manufacturing and sales at arm's length. And Russ Jones took care of the sales for us. And the idea was, let's dip our toe in it, and then we may start making our own products. The irony is it took 10 years before we made our own products because after those bass pedals, I'd met Keith Barr and Russell Palmer, the founders of Alesis, and Keith really wanted to do a drum machine and sequencer, and that was, you could say it's kind of like the DMX and DSX over again, but much more affordable, and now in the MIDI era, and make it for the masses. And so they contracted us to do that, and that led to a decade of 40 products or so for Alesis.
Yeah,
and I definitely put on the back burner any efforts of us doing our own products.
Those drum machines and that sequencer, the HR-16 and stuff like that. I worked at a music store at the time, and we bought a bunch of those in for inventory because we could sell them so much faster than the Roland R series drum machines and stuff that was there. Those things sold like mad. And for most folks will remember them, but they had a very 80s design. It was like a little parallelogram wedge type thing with a flip top and the whole thing. It was kind of like if an answering machine grew up into a drum machine. It was such a fun device.
Yeah, that was, and the mechanical design, that was all Keith Barr. He was, this was a great learning experience for us because he was willing to invest in the injection molding. He knew this was going to be something he wanted to make a lot of. And he had the idea of he wanted the little flip-up lid and the instructions and so on. I wrote the specs of, what the features are, what the buttons needed to be. And then I that's back in the day when I used to write all the software too. So I did all the software in both of those products. Nice. And that was good fun, a little 8051 processor being pushed to its limits. Yep. But it was, it was another great learning experience because you have to realize from the Oberheim era, and then even the Dynacord, because this was an expensive digital drum set. I mean, it was being used by, the drums we did for Dynacord, it was, Jeff Porcaro and Danny Gottlieb and Omar Hakim and, all these top drummers were endorsing it and playing it. But it was expensive. And then this Alesis drum machine and sequencer come out at affordable prices, and they're selling thousands per month. And it honestly, to that point, just never occurred to me that there could be such a thirst for, affordable, great music technology. So that was a real eye-opener and definitely influenced a lot of what we did later. In fact, I don't think we would have had the foresight to do what we did with Line 6 had we not had the experience with Alesis.
Yeah, we sold a ton of those, and it's interesting. Even today, they've resurfaced in a big way with mods and glitch type stuff. Like they're really popular for that. Yeah.
I'm not even sure how people are doing some of that. It's quite funny. I mean, I still have the source code, and that still seems daunting, but somehow they managed to hack it. It's really fun. Actually, what I'm still quite amused about is that the SR-16, which was the last drum machine we did, which we designed, I think it came out in 1990. That drum machine is still on the market today. It's been for sale since 1990.
Wow.
It's like, And it's the exact same functionality. The irony is if you opened up one today versus one from 1990, it's completely different inside because you can't even get some of the parts we were using back in 90. So they've had to redesign. It was several years ago. I think they redesigned the hardware to still run the same functionality. And but yeah, might be a record for a technology product.
Oh, it would have
so.
to be. It'd have to be. And in our pre-discussion, I mentioned to Marcus that I hadn't seen any of those little drum machines, those first drum machines, for like decades. And one popped up on the marketplace, and they were asking some ridiculous amount of money. But you know what? It sold. It sold.
Oh, that's funny.
It sold straight away. So that was an interesting one.
Well, that's the funny thing. The SR16 will probably never have that problem because you can just go buy a new one for $150.
Go buy
Or
a
the
new one.
bane of reverb.com. Right?
Yeah.
No, but I mean, it's this. There's new ones are still available. In fact,
Yeah.
I'm almost surprised someone hasn't decided that they can hear a difference and can explain why a vintage SR16 is better.
Yeah, then you're going to get the purist versus the new ones. And just quickly on those two products, and just following on from what Pete said about just the impact that they had in the market. You know, the competing drum machines, you had, you know, the Yamaha, and I had a Yamaha RX-11, I think it was, at the time. So there was drum machines from Roland and Yamaha, and there was very different approaches between those two because, you know, Roland was going more for the 808 and the 909 kind of more analogy type of sounds, and Yamaha were more into the digital sampling drum machines, more like the Alesis product. But as far as standalone sequences, I mean, there was a few, but the only one that really comes to mind that had any impact apart from that little Alesis one was the Roland MC500, if you remember that one.
Yeah.
That was ghastly expensive. But now, did that – I've just got to remember – did that little Alesis have floppy disk storage, like the sequencer?
There was no. It was still in the day of cassette interface,
right?
And SysX backup. But we did come out with a product called the Data Disk,
right?
Which was a single rack 3.5 inch floppy that was kind of a universal record any SysX storage.
Okay.
So that was the easiest way to back this stuff up,
right?
But when you talk about that world of sequencer and drum machines, I just if I may, I think I like to think that one of the reasons that those products were so successful and why they were different than some done by bigger companies is when you're a small company, it's not uncommon to have the customer and the designer be the same person. You think about what Roger Lynn did with the original LM1, which was just a groundbreaking product, or Dave Smith with the Prophet 5. These were guys these are the boxes they wanted. They knew this was, Roger's a guitar player, songwriter, and he designed the product he wanted, and it was brilliant. And Dave Smith he loved his Mini Moog. He designed the synthesizer he wanted that no one was doing. And there didn't have to be a lot of meetings or discussions, or nothing was lost in translation in trying to explain to the engineer what the musician wants, because it was just the same person.
Yep.
So the DSX and DMX, at the Oberheim era, the DSX and DMX, I mean, those are the machines we wanted, and they were great for their time, but they were very expensive. Now, the MMT8 and HR16 had way more capability than those Oberheim products at a fraction of the price, but the approach to the design was very much from a musician's standpoint, because I do feel I'm a musician first who happens to be a technologist. And I think that's why those products were successful.
Oh, no, 100%. 100%. And look, and I think there is with a lot of the current stuff, there's a disconnect between the people that are coding and engineering the stuff, and actually the end users. And that's a really long discussion that especially with some software application where I always have a bit of a chuckle saying, is it a bug or working as designed? And do the code guys actually know the difference? So there you go. Hey, now with the Alesis stuff, I do want to discuss probably the most, for me, the most iconic product that you engineered and developed would have to be the ADAT, because, where some things are evolutionary, that wasn't an evolution, that was a revolution. That was an amazing product. And I was involved in that front line in pro audio and music technology retail right when that thing hit. So I was there right at the start when those black faces hit. And I just remember the impact that it had on the industry, because the hard disk recording era it was starting, but it was, people, we got two track and then 4 track and then 8 track, and it was a real struggle even to get 8 tracks back then. And then, the hard drives were, recalibrating in the middle of recording. This is the type of stuff that Evan Brooks was telling us, and it was just a nightmare. But it was evolving, but the computer technology wasn't quite there yet. And so even at 8 tracks, you can record it. Where do you store it? I mean, because the hard drives were quite small, and the storage, the cost of the storage was like through the roof. So how do you archive the stuff? And along comes ADAT, and 8 tracks, and then you can sync multiple for up to, I think it was 128 tracks, if I'm correct, Marcus.
There wasn't really a technical limit. We did say we made it 16 machines is kind of where we put a hard stop, and we made the BRC able to control up to 16 machines, so 128 tracks. But there wasn't really a technical constraint. You actually could do more, but it was be kind of silly to do it. Yeah,
I never saw any more than maybe 4 here in Australia. But, that was still pretty crazy back then, So you got 32 tracks of digital across these 4 machines all synced together with the BRC. So, look, that is a fascinating product. Can you give us some insight on how that actually came about?
Sure. Well, the origin starts with Keith Barr. Keith Barr was co-founder of Alesis. Before Alesis, he co-founded MXR. He was really a brilliant technologist and innovator, and I learned a lot from him. And I like to think what I learned the most from him about the ADAT was just his audacity and sheer nerve to even propose to do something that bold. There was no question right away. We all said, well, of course we'd want it, right? I mean, think about that. In 1988 or 89, when we started working on it, saying, so how would you like to have, an affordable digital 8-track recorder that you could use at home and daisy chain as many as you want? It was like a no-brainer, right? Sometimes you develop products and you're not sure if the customer will want it. There was no question everyone will want this if we could do it.
No, of course.
The real question in our minds was, can we do this? We don't know anything about tape recorders. Mm-hmm. We don't know anything about magnetic recording. I mean, I've used magnetic recording. I'd been involved. I'd been doing a lot of session work, so I'd actually had the good fortune of recording with Sony Dash machines or the Mitsubishi or 3M digital machines. So I knew how incredible it would be to have something like that, because remember, that's in an era when the only recordings people were doing at home was demos. It was on Porta Studios, or maybe I think I had a Fostex 8-track at the time, 1/4 inch. And it never sounded like what you could do in a studio. So it was just demo quality. And this notion that you could actually do professional quality at home was like the Holy Grail. So Keith was in Taiwan at the time, and we would be sending faxes back and forth. It just tells the era, not emails. Faxes back and forth every night, discussing, different tape formats and what what format should we use? And then once we'd settled on VHS, what tape speed, what drum rotation, track pitch, interleave, error correction, everything, right? It's just kind of like starting from scratch. I mean, the only thing that was off the shelf was the transport itself, but it had custom heads and a custom drum, and it was a big undertaking and a very exciting project to work on, and somehow we managed to pull it off.
Yeah. Now, so was with the VHS transport, was it running faster than standard? I can't remember.
Yeah,
it was. Yeah.
Yeah, the standard VHS speed, you got about 2 hours of video at the standard speed, I think, or slow speed. I forget what they called it.
Yep.
We got about 40 minutes of audio on that same tape.
Yeah.
So we were running at a faster speed. The drum was rotating faster. The drum was, in the video world, was at the frame rate. So depending on if you were in Europe or US, the drum would be different.
Yep.
In our case, we had the drum rotating faster. It was at 50 hertz. So basically every 20 milliseconds, the drum would rotate, which is 960 samples at 48 kilohertz. So basically each of two helical tracks, right, because the tape is wrapped 180 degrees around this drum. So you have two write heads and two read heads. So you basically would have, with each rotation, 960 samples per track, per channel, I should say, which to differentiate from the actual physical track on the tape, because the channels were interleaved. So it was, so everything about how the transport was run was different than VHS.
Yeah. And I think that was the wear point, from memory. Once they got a fair few hours on them, and I've got some funny recollections. And when we'd get people that had been using the ADATs and they wanted to trade them in for maybe some fresh units, or maybe when the XT came out. And the first question we'd ask them was like, how many hours are on these units? And they'd always lie, Marcus. It's couple of hundred hours,
Well, we had the truth detector on there. I don't know if there was a hidden page. You could see how many hours the machine had been run.
That's what I was about to get to. So we're like, how many hours, guys? And they're going, 100 hours, a couple hundred hours. I'm going, and we knew about that button press to bring the menu up, and then up would come up 10,000 hours. And I'm like, no, guys, no, thanks, mate. Throw them in the bin. We're not going to touch them, So that was the funny story.
The heads could wear out over enough time, but a properly maintained ADAT could really last quite a long time. But yeah, there's time you could replace the rotary heads, but for the most part, it was a pretty robust system.
But there's the point. Perfectly maintained. Do you think these guys were maintaining these units?
Yeah, not typically. That's true.
No,
but it was quite robust. You have to recognize that at the time, state of the art, 8mm video. There were DAT machines and 8mm digital video, and of course, the Tascam system used the 8mm tape.
Yep,
these were really tiny, 20 micron or smaller track pitch that was, you had to have a great deal of accuracy, and that just scared us to death about how can you maintain machine-to-machine calibration accuracy. So our tracks were 100 microns wide. I would do demos sometimes where I'd take the VHS tape and have a recording on it, and then take it out and open the door of the VHS and put a big thumbprint on the tape and put it back in and rewind and play it back, and you wouldn't hear any problem. I'd say try that on any small format tape, and you're going to obliterate it.
You're not a hope.
So it was really robust. Although I do know, clearly I'm biased, but I do know the ADAT. A lot of people had a love-hate relationship with the ADAT, and certainly there were people who had troubles with it. I think a lot of the problems had to do with just the growing pains for Alesis in becoming a manufacturer that could make large quantities of $4,000 tape recorders, which is a little different than, making $500 drum machines or reverbs. But the irony of that design, one of the earliest problems we had with ADAT that gave us a little black eye early on, is that we were so paranoid about the tape format and the robustness and the error correction, et cetera. I feel like in some ways we even over-designed some of that. It is robust. So, but the first production run units of ADATs, we started hearing about failures in the field. It's like ADATs they literally just turned off. They just stopped working. And of course, it turns out to be, it was such a basic problem that got overlooked. I can laugh about it now. It hurt at the time, but if you've seen inside the blackface ADAT, there's a power supply is mounted upside down in one of the compartments, and it was a switching power supply, but it wanted to be separated and isolated to make sure we could have the best noise performance. So it's mounted upside down, which there's no problem for. But the bridge rectifier diodes that were spec'd were just a little under-spec'd. And with the right circumstances, depending on your line voltage, I think it especially happened in Europe, the bridge diodes could get so hot that it started to loosen the solder. And so the bridge would, if it got hot enough, it literally would just fall out of the board. And now you simply had no connection. So we jokingly called it a gravity fuse. Because basically just, if your ADAT had been upside down, it wouldn't work so well, but that would never happen on the power supply. But as that's what happens sometimes in design, especially of complex things. You're so focused on the really, really hard stuff that you might overlook something that's, frankly, that should have been caught.
Yeah, you missed the smaller stuff.
Yeah. We quickly fixed that and took care of it, but we did get a few lumps from that.
Yeah, and look, we're 240 volt here in Australia, so I suspect that we had the same problem. And I kind of vaguely remember some of them just deciding to switch off from memory. But this was a long time ago. But the other part of ADAT, which is still widely used to this day, is the ADAT protocol. Now, just before we get to that, though, they dived into hard disk recording, but this is after your involvement. But you were mentioning that, in our pre-chat, that you were having some pre-discussion about maybe doing a tapeless ADAT really early on.
Yeah, it seemed obvious to us. I don't know. The ADAT finally shipped at, I guess, the very tail end of 91 or early 92.
Mm-hmm.
And, Pro Tools came out the same time.
Yeah.
Evan and Peter, started out, Sound Tools became Pro Tools, as you've discussed before. And it seemed to us that was certainly the future. But we had a giant advantage in that VHS tape was the equivalent of 2 gigabytes of storage.
Yep, correct.
For $10.
Yeah, yep.
Which is unheard of. Think about it, 1991.
Right.
I was actually just looking it up. I don't even know if this is correct. There's one site that says basically 2 gigabytes of hard disk would cost you about $20,000.
Oh.
Or certainly over $10,000, right? You just didn't even think of having that much storage in a hard disk. I mean, at least not your average consumer, right? So but there was no question that with Moore's Law, it's eventually going to get cheaper and cheaper. And there's so many advantages of recording to hard disk. But tape was, we intentionally designed a product that we felt that anyone who'd ever used a tape recorder could use. There was zero learning curve on an ADAT, right? Arm your tracks, press record. The only new button you had to care about was the format button. So if we could just explain that well enough, just press format the first time you record, anybody could use it. Whereas computer hard disk recording was completely a new frontier. So it was very expensive, very unreliable, very difficult. but we knew all of those things were going to change.
Yep.
So around 93, we proposed to Alesis our vision of the future digital studio. And even for a little bit, we even tried to initiate some partnership with DigiDesign, because we were working with DigiDesign as well. We designed all the sample cell products.
Right. Okay.
The sample cell cards. So we had a great relationship with DigiDesign and with Alesis, and we thought it's almost like the two companies are the left brain and right brain of musicians, and if we could kind of bring them together. But we really felt that there was the functionality of an ADAT. There's something really great about having a product that you just turn on and press record and you can start capturing stuff, and there's no configuration and setup and, the operating system changed and now nothing works. It just works, right? So to be able to have that functional immediacy, but then bring all the advantages of the computer. So our notion was to make a dedicated hard disk recorder that could also function as the audio source when connected to a computer. So you didn't have to even transfer files. The notion was you capture on your hard disk recorder in an ADAT style, and you could even make it synchronize and connect with tape-based ADATs so that you could kind of facilitate a transition if you were a tape-based studio wanting to dabble in this.
Yep.
And then you just, you turn on your computer and now you do all your nonlinear stuff under computer control. And then we proposed some digital mixers at the time of how you could have hardware versions of that, since it was still way early to imagine doing all of that in the computer. And anyway, sorry for the long story. The real headline of that experience was it was the first time that Alesis said, no, we don't want to do that.
Right.
Every other product we'd proposed to Alesis, it's like, hey, let's do keyboards now. Let's do this. They were like, sure. And this time they said no. And I thought, wow, that's concerning, because now it's been a great ride, but ADAT will end someday, and what do we do then? So that's really ended up being a big part of the motivation to start Line 6.
Yeah. And look, interestingly, that product, and I had to do a little bit of research just before we came on, because I do remember that that hard disk recorder, they eventually did it, but it was like 2000 and let me have a look here, 2002, Marcus. And so the horse had definitely bolted, because by that time, we were recording dozens of tracks onto computers, and they were very, very reliable, whether it was Mac or PC. And so the horse had bolted, and I'm not sure how well that product did.
Yeah, it was too little, too late.
Yeah,
I'm afraid. Yeah,
I think so. But the ADAT protocol, and that's one thing that I want to discuss, because that's something that is still.
I did get off track on that.
No, that was my fault. That was look, that's an innovation that is still used today, and I'm using it all the time personally, and my clients are absolutely bound to it. And it's an amazing technology. If you think about it, so that was. Like that came out with the original blackface. So what was that? 91, 92?
Well, we had the optical designed in 90. It was. So it's over 30 years old.
So that's amazing.
Which is pretty good.
Yeah.
We're really proud of that. That was I think the only reason that still exists is that we were fortunate enough to realize that it'd be really great to make this 24-bit capable. Even though we didn't have a path to getting the tape machines to 24-bit, we practically only felt 20 was viable, and actually, frankly, we felt 20 was good enough. We didn't want to increase the density so far as to support 24 on the tape, but we made the optical 24, and there really were no options back then. I mean, it wasn't like the goal was to make a proprietary interface. It's just, how else could you do 8 channels of audio? You couldn't on ASCBU. You couldn't, although some people were doing higher clock rates on that by then. Even MADI was very expensive, so we just figured we should be able to design something that's just It's very purposeful. I mean, it's the ADAT optical is not very flexible. I mean, the cable itself. Sorry, bad pun. But what I mean is the protocol. I mean, it's really just designed to do one thing. You look at there's a 256-bit stream, and it's like, here you go. Here's 8 channels of 24-bit audio, or 4 channels at double sample rate. Yeah.
That's right, maximum 48. And I've got a story to share with the with that as well. So now the first computer card that actually had the ADAT interface was a Sonorous, and I remember being an early adopter of one of those. And let me tell you, I think if you want to talk about bleeding edge, I was on the bleeding edge with that one. But the whole 48K limit, which for the majority of people is still fine, but if you want to go to 96, you can use SMUX, which is something that Sonorous actually developed. Now, I've got a funny story that I want to share because it's only been quite recent, and it's part of the actual design. When you do the SMUX that Sonorous came up with, that if you wanted to use, you needed to use 2 of the ADAT channels, but they had to be right next to each other.
Right.
So that's fine if you've got an 8-channel A to D and D to A, and you want to go from 48 to 96, and then you just you can flick between the 2 sample rates, and the channel routing layout does not change. But if you've got 16 channels, so you've got 2 A to D and D to A's, 8 channels each, and you're running them at 48. But if you want to run them, you want to configure it so that it also run at 96. The problem arises that because you have to use the ADAT ports next to each other, that when you're flicking between 96 and 48, it changes the actual routing of the second A to D and D to A. You know what I mean?
No.
I'll explain it a little bit better. So you've got at 40, if you're running just standard 48,
right,
you would use the first 2 channels, so then 1 to 16 is lined up in your with for RME we'll say total mix, right? So you've got your 16 channels, 1 to 8 is on the first A to D and D to A, 9 to 16 is on the second.
Right.
When you're using SMUX, because you're using the second ADAT channel which is next to each other, so the first A to D and D to A is using what would originally be the first 16 channels, but that's 1 to 8. And then the second one will be using 3 and 4. And so what actually happens is that when you switch between 48 and 96, or 96 back to 48, the routing goes from 1 to 8, and then the next one goes from 17 to 24. It actually shifts the routing. So, and I'm looking at this, and this is years. I hadn't done a 96 SMUX setup for ages, and I went, this just doesn't make any sense. We should be able to just go, okay, 48, 96. If we could choose the ADAT channels 1 and 3 for the first one, and 2 and 4, and then you can switch between 48 and 96, and the routing wouldn't change. So I actually proposed that to Matthias over at RME, because we're using one of the radar cards. And I said, why can't we do this? He goes, but Vin, it's never been part of the spec. That's just the way it is. We have to accept it. I've gone, well, I don't want to accept it. It just doesn't make any sense. And he was great. And then a couple of days later, he said, you know what, I've been talking to the engineering team. He goes, we can actually do it. I went, really? And he said, I'm not going to make any. That's great. He goes, I'm not going to make any promises on the timeline, but it is on the to-do list, because you know what? After we had that discussion, we said, you know what? Vin's right. This doesn't make any sense. Why hasn't anyone actually looked at this over the course of 25 years or 30 years and said, hey, wouldn't it be a good idea if we set up SMUX so that when you're switching between 96 and 48, you'd keep the same channel IO routing? So, look, I think that's on his to-do list, but he's had far more important curves to navigate with the chip shortages and stuff. So that's a discussion that I'll pick up with him again. But look, that ADAT protocol, I mean, Marcus, that's just phenomenal. That's almost as good as MIDI, the longevity.
Yeah, it's not done too bad.
So look, anything up to 48K, I say to the clients, ADAT. Anything above that, they're going to either have to go to AES or are MADI, still ADAT. You'll see ADAT on far more interfaces than MADI or AES when you think about it. Yeah. So I mean, fantastic, and that was, I don't think you would have expected it to be still kind of happening at 30 years later. Well, maybe you did.
No, it is interesting. I mean, it was really the best we could do. And maybe similar to MIDI, MIDI now is, we do recognize that it would have been nice for it to be faster, but, it's about as much speed as you could put through opto isolators back in the day, or affordable ones. And the ADAT spec, similarly, we were using the Toslink connectors that were used for standard, optical SPDIF, and we were technically running them a little bit above their spec ratings. So it was really the most we could get out of it. It would have been nice to design something that could be expandable to more channels and so on. I suppose with today's technology, if someone really wanted to, if there's faster optical parts, you could have higher channel count and higher sample rate using the same concept. But it's pretty straightforward. It's running on a 12.288 megahertz clock, and it's a pretty simple self-clocking protocol that spits out 8 channels of 24-bit audio, and that's all it does. And it does it well.
Yeah, perfect for the task. Yeah. And look, and there are other protocols. I've mentioned them before. You've got AES, AES and MADI, and up to 192. And so for the people that need to kind of dive into that pool, they've got a solution.
Right. You've got Dante, which now can do, you can do lots of channels of audio over a simple cable. So there's lots of good choices. Yeah,
that whole Ethernet audio, I'm in two minds with that one. And I've seen the good, and I've seen the good and the bad, and the latency stuff. You actually need the DSP cards, and now they've stopped manufacturing the DSP cards, and RME have got a solution there, but that's because they're using their FPGA and their drivers.
Yeah. Well, it might again be another case. I don't want to be presumptuous, since I don't know how all of those things came about, but a lot of the times those types of protocols, they're designed by engineers, and they're trying to design something that can be, reliable, robust, but also very flexible, et cetera. And then you have to translate for the user how to really understand how it works, and it becomes very complicated. Whereas, case in point, the ADAT optical, it was designed very much with musicians in mind. You shouldn't have to know anything. You can tell what's an input and what's an output, because the output has a red light coming out of it.
Yep, correct.
And you just plug it in, and it's self-clocking. You had to press one button, digital in, instead of analog in. You didn't even need the 9-pin sync cable. The sync cable was only required if you wanted to have the position of the tape locked. But if you just wanted to do a digital backup from one ADAT to another, and you don't care if they'll be sample locked, but they won't be position locked, you hook up one optical cable, and it will just always work.
Yep.
There's no configuration. There's no change in latency and frankly, it's how I wish more things worked that way. And I think that's probably also why MIDI has had such longevity, is MIDI can do a lot of things, but it also just works without having to do a lot of configuration.
Yeah. My first experience with the Dante, oh boy, that was wasn't exactly the smoothest. I was lucky enough to get the Focusrite RedNet systems very early on. So they sent these units across, and I pride myself in being pretty good with this computer technology stuff, but this thing was doing my head in. It was requiring managed switches, and I'm not overly versed in networking, and you really needed a high level of networking knowledge, and I just couldn't get this thing to work. It was just literally doing my head in. I sent this whole thing back, and I know over the years, and it's actually improved, and I'd been speaking to close friends and colleagues of mine in the US that were one of the premium dealers for this whole RedNet, And one of the engineers there, he was a network guru, this guy. And he was just, some of the stories he was telling me, I'm like, oh, man. I mean, there was things like, if you lose power for a split second and the units are not switching themselves back on in the correct order, you lose the whole thing.
Oh yeah, it can be really tricky, and it is a complicated system. I mean, for it to be as capable and flexible as it is, there may be no other way. I've got a Dante set up at my home studio that works fantastic, but I've blocked from memory what it took to get it all set up.
Yeah.
it was pretty complex. I mean, I have a lot of channels because I've got a live room with everything hooked up that's connected to the main room, and I've got a whole nuendo setup. And one of the things that's nice actually is that saved me is that there's a Yamaha actually does a lot of networking hardware, mainly in Japan, but they have a pretty high level switch that they've configured specifically for Dante.
Perfect.
And that once I switched over to that did make things a little easier, because like that's all I want this to do is make sure Dante works.
Yep.
So now I can just turn it on and things actually work, which is nice.
Yeah, 100%. I've done over the years. I've done only one nuendo nuage system, but that worked perfectly. And I've done a few RedNet systems, both with the DSP, the dedicated DSP card, and also with the RME solutions, and they work. I mean, once I got my head around it. It's fine, but like Marcus says, I kind of block out. I literally block out what it actually takes to get it, and then when it finally all works, you just kind of go, that's
thank goodness. And then when that day comes when it doesn't work, you go, okay, why do I start?
Yeah. So I'm far more confident with it now. But look, it's interesting. AudioNate stopped supply of those DSP chips, so they're getting pretty rare.
Really?
Yeah, the PCIe cards are rare, and I was speaking to my Focusrite rep this week actually, because a client was chasing the card for some big install. And I remember the fact that they had been EOLs, and so I quickly contacted my rep, and there was 4 left in existence, and I had to say to the client, look, there's only a couple left in the country. Oh no, I'm sounding like a typical salesman, there's only a couple left. You better order them. But I actually confided in him that, look, these things are EOL. And we're not sure whether there's going to, how long before there's going to be a replacement card or chip from AudioNate. And, the timeline is about, they reckon, you'd be lucky if it's going to be the end of this year. So I actually forwarded, I had to tell the client that, and he just said, you know what, I'm doing a huge installation with hundreds of channels of audio that this installation needs to be bulletproof for 10 years. He says, I can't touch the cards. I said, well, I don't know what the solution's going to be. Because the RME one does not offer 128 channels at 96. It's only 64. So there's 128 channels on the RME unit, but it's 64 Dante and 64 Maddie.
Oh wow!
So
see, I'm using the Yamaha PCI card that does 128 channel Dante.
Yeah, it's exactly the same as the RedNet. That was an AudioNate supplied card that they basically rebadged, because there's no dedicated Yamaha driver or dedicated Focusrite driver for these. They're basically, it's the AudioNate supplied driver.
Is this chip shortage fallout, or?
Yeah, well, I'm curious as well. Why would they stop making them?
It would have to be. I mean, look, I'm making we're only guessing, but I would have to be. They made that announcement about third quarter last year it was, and I went, okay, because that guarantees a low latency performance on these, as you know, Marcus. Because
it works well.
Well, could you imagine connecting your Dante network just via normal Ethernet, and the playback latency? You'd be like, what? It'd be inoperable. I mean, for live For live and installation stuff, yeah, you could probably get away with it, but not if there's any latency, live performance aspect to it. So it would have to be a chip shortage thing. So that's one to watch. Yeah, that's an interesting one, and I can't even remember how we got onto Dante.
Well, I guess just it's
the ADAT,
much more versatile than ADAT optical, but not quite as simple.
That's how we got there. Hey, now let's move on to the next. We'll call it the next phase of your career, and that is fast forward design up to about 96, and then line 6. Your own company. Now, you've got to repeat this story, Marcus. I know you've probably told it a few times, but you have to tell us how. One, well, actually, how the company eventuated, but two, how the company name came about, because that's an awesome story.
Sure, absolutely. Well, so before there was such a thing as Line 6, really a convergence of several things happened that ended up being fortuitous. One is, as I mentioned, Alesis not being interested in kind of pursuing this digital future we'd envisioned made us realize we're going to have to consider what other path we might take, including possibly doing our own products. And then at the same time, we really were feeling like guitar players were being left behind in technology, which seemed intriguing to us. And at the same time, I happened to discover a DSP chip that Texas Instruments Japan division had developed. It was intended for audio for use in higher end home receivers to do surround sound and things like that. But it was probably designed for JVC or one of those types of companies specifically, because you have to remember in the first half of the 90s, DSP chips were really still quite expensive.
Right.
All the DSP we'd done with Alesis, we'd done custom chips. We didn't want to invest the money in doing our own custom chip. So it was right at that inflection point of, will DSPs be affordable enough to just use off-the-shelf DSPs? And I saw this part. It was a 24-bit fixed point part that was selling for about $10. So that was a pretty big breakthrough for its time.
Mm-hmm.
It took me quite a while to convince Texas Instruments to sell it to us because they had no intentions in selling it to any U.S. customers.
Oh.
No one in the U.S. was making, home receivers. And so, a company like TI, they want to have the whole infrastructure. Their salespeople and technical people are all trained and so on, and to support it. So I had to convince them that we needed no support. We just want the part. We'll figure it out, and finally convinced them. So now we had a part we thought might have enough DSP to model basically a tube or valve, depending on your preference, which was kind of where we started. And it began really as a research project to see if we could, the basic goal being, if we could recreate in software what the interesting tonal characteristics were of a wide range of guitar amps, that seemed like it'd be a real breakthrough. I mean, really just trying to bring to the guitar player the advantages that keyboard players had. Right? I could push a button and have a Hammond, push a button, have a Rhodes, have a clavinet. I could have all the flavors of keyboards at my disposal. Why shouldn't a guitar player have all the flavors of guitar amps and effects at their disposal? And so it just seemed like a natural need, but now we needed to prove whether or not we could actually do it. So this team, we were about 11 people by that time. Michelle and myself and 6 other engineers, and Susan on the business side, and we. So we had a payroll, and we needed to continue to support this group. So it made sense to figure out what this new chapter would be. We were still working on products for Alesis and other companies, so we just kind of set aside a bit of our resources, some engineering to start working on this. And Michel himself did quite a bit of the early research. Now, to do the research, this is what will get to the name story, but to do research on modeling of an amp, you want to do measurements and characterize these original amps. And if you are taking a classic Marshall or any amp, you want a high gain sound that doesn't have master volume, there's no way to do it other than to really crank it up. So needless to say, there was quite often that we'd have blaring guitar amps going on in the offices. And we thought that might seem a little odd for when we have visitors. If someone from Alesis or Digidesign or someone was to come to visit, they'd wonder why this company that Fast Forward Designs that doesn't do any guitar products, why are their guitars blasting in this office? So we realized, well, we should probably shut up when people come over. And so we needed to have some way to signal that. And we had 5 phone lines in Fast Forward Designs. This back in the day when you had, phone lines all shared on a trunk, and it would rotate along. So, and then we had a receptionist. If someone called for one of us, you'd go on the PA and say, you have a call on line 2 or a call on line 3. And so since we only had 5 phone lines, we decided if the receptionist sees someone comes in that's, we don't want them hearing guitars, they should get on the PA and page one of us and say we have a call on line 6, because there is no line 6. And that's how we would know we should shut up the guitar stuff.
That was awesome.
So basically, it started out as a silly little code for us to shut up. It was never intended to be a company name or anything. I mean, or at least at that time, it wasn't. It served no other purpose than to be our little secret code. And then, of course, it was probably another 1.5, 2 years when we really had completed our research and defined the product and made a prototype. And now we needed a company name. We didn't want to call it Fast Forward Designs. I mean, that was our company name. We thought it needs to have a brand name. And I was quite fond of brands that were 2 syllables that also didn't define what they did. Mm-hmm. So brands like Apple or Roland or Sony, they became great brands because of what they did, but not because of what their name is, right?
Yep.
Those names all mean something to us now. They wouldn't mean anything by themselves, right?
Right.
But they mean something because of what the companies did. So we racked our brains for forever trying to come up with a 2-syllable name that we liked, and we were completely stumped. And Sue, once again, since she named Fast Forward Designs, I think she finally said, well, why don't we just call it line 6? And we all kind of looked at each other and went,
Yep.
Yeah, that works.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
We're done. We have a company, we have a brand name, and line 6 it was.
I could just imagine what the office was like back then. I'm assuming this was not a massive office. It's a small office with one room with a heck of a lot of guitar amps in it. We were pretty lucky. It was actually a pretty luxurious amount of space for how few people we had. I mean, Sue had found a great little building in Culver City it was literally right next to a cemetery. And so maybe that's why we got a decent deal. I don't know. Yeah. That turned out to come in handy when we decided to blast amps outside, because we knew we wouldn't be bothering the neighbors.
You wouldn't be waking the dead, yeah.
Exactly. But we did have a studio room, and I mean, there was one large lab that was a big open area where we did most of the development, but then there were individual offices and everything. It was pretty comfortable. I mean, in fact, it was enough extra room that when we first started making our first product, the Axis 212, we were actually building them in that space. And then it became really cramped very quickly. So very quickly, Sue had to find another building, still in LA, but we actually manufactured of the first generation, the Axis 212 and its successor, the AX2. I think it was close to 20,000 guitar amps we built in Los Angeles.
Wow. That's awesome.
Back in those early days. It was pretty crazy. painting boxes, wrapping vinyl, stretching speaker grill, all these capabilities that were the furthest from our core competencies as you could have, given that, we were really all about what was on the inside.
Yeah.
But we thought it'd be a good idea for us to really understand every aspect of building an amp and what that's about. So we just went for it.
Having the hands-on, yeah, perfect. And the story about having the amps blaring in a small office space, that's reminiscent of the stories that Nicholas Oberheim from Softtube had actually shared with us when he was on the show.
That's great.
Yeah, so
I remember they visited us early on. Actually, it was quite nice. It's really great that we have such a friendly industry, because it's, technically you could say they were competitors, but they showed us what they were working on, and we wished them good luck. They've done well. Yeah,
he had some very nice things to say about his interactions with you guys during the show, that's nice. It was in the context of the discussion. It started off because the whole discussion was about component level modeling. And I passed on to him that my first personal experience with modelled guitar amps, even though I'm a keyboard player, I've got some very talented friends that are incredible guitar players, and the rep actually for line 6 back in the day, in the late 90s, comes up to me, and in the show he walks in with the kidney bean pod. And so I walked out of my keyboard lab area, and I'm into the guitar room, and I'm listening to this thing going, I want one of these. I need one of these. Because, I do, at the time I was writing, a lot of prog and prog metal type of stuff. And so the rectifier, that super high gain Saldana / rectifier type of guitar tone is what I needed. And we couldn't get it with any of the digital products, and we weren't going to be cranking in a rectifier or a VHT into a home studio, because the thing's got to be glowing red hot. so this little kidney bean pod was a bit of a revelation for us, or revolution. Let's call it a revolution. And so I brought it home, and we fired it up, and I've still got those recordings that I can actually refer back to. That was the first recordings that we did with that little kidney bean pod. And I actually shared some of this story with you in the pre-chat, where this little kidney bean pod was not a release product, was actually a pre-release. And the models in the unit were a little bit different to the release one. And the way that I discovered that was that after we finished the recording, my mate kidnapped it. He says, right, can I borrow this? I've never got it back. He still has it, by the way. Right? And I had to go buy another one. And then he came back to finish off some recording, and we were using my newly purchased one, and we dialed up exactly the same, what we thought were exactly the same settings, and it sounded different. And we looked at each other and went, what's going on here? And have you got the old one? Have you got the original? He goes, yeah, I've got it in my kit bag. I said, go grab it. And so we managed to do the A/B, and we went, they sound different. They didn't sound bad, but it sounded different. So we had to go back and use the original kidney bean pod. And then the rep actually, a little bit later, I'm saying to him, they sound different. He says, good or bad? I went, no, just different, right? So, that's a point of perspective, whether it's better or worse. I just noticed the difference. And so he managed to source the updated EEPROMs for the pod. He goes, here, you can update to the latest one. I said, I don't want to.
Yeah.
So we kept the two. So there's a slight character difference between the two, which was pretty amazing. So that was my first experience with the pod, and
that's great.
The conversation with Nicholas was about the modeling techniques back then, because you guys were the first, and was it component level modeling? And I suppose, can you share anything?
Sure.
Yeah.
I first feel compelled to say our philosophy fundamentally was always, it really doesn't matter. I used to joke to say, I don't care if there's a hamster spinning around in a wheel in a product. If it sounds great, then I'm happy,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
And so our objective is always about how something sounds, how something will work for the musician, rather than being technologists getting hung up on exactly what approach is taken. So I can tell you quite honestly, in many products we've developed, we came up with what I think were fairly innovative but unorthodox techniques that got us the result we wanted, that if you were, taking a clinical approach or you were at a university, you might not do that. I mean, simple examples back in the day, it's like the pitch shifting in a quadriverb is very crude, but for small amounts of detuning, it works quite well. And if you were studying how to do pitch shifting, well, you'd need a lot more processing power than we had in the quadriverb.
Right.
But we were able to get a really useful effect by doing something a little unusual. All that said, when we were working on original modeling, we looked at, could you model each and every individual component and arrive at the result? And technically, yes. It's like, could you copy each individual atom of the Mona Lisa and end up with that painting? Yeah, you could. But what we wanted is, well, can we make this painting look good and use the resources we have, because we want to make affordable products. And so rather than component level, I mean, the modeling evolved to where we were doing component level modeling. There's so many more times power in the helix than we had in the original pod. It's unbelievable.
Of course.
So the modeling, of course, has evolved tremendously. But back then it was like, let's look at a section of how the circuit works and recognize where you essentially could model subsections of circuitry rather than the individual components, and be able to capture, but here's what this does. Here's the transfer function of this particular tone control, or here's how this nonlinear process is working, and so on. And you could create models of elements and recognize, and then do A/B tests and listen and go, if something sounds great, well, then we're good to go.
Yep.
I mean, I could give countless examples of where that's played out really well. I mean, early keyboard sampler products that we did, we used very simple linear interpolation to do the pitch shifting, which mathematically you can show why that is not accurate and where the errors will be. But you actually can do listening, and it sounds great. Or another example is the HR-16, back the drum machines we were talking about earlier. The HR-16, the name HR was high resolution, because drum machines typically had been 8-bit before then. Well, what was, it was a secret at the time, but probably known by anyone who's studied it since. The HR-16 samples were 8-bit.
Right.
But it has a better than 16-bit dynamic range.
Right.
And it was a very simple trick in which what happens is there's it was a type of floating point that used less than half as much data as would have been required if it was linear. Basically, you're always taking the most significant 8 bits, but you're making the assumption as a rule that every sound you have will decay. It's a drum. It would not sound good to be a sustained sound. If you sampled a trumpet on it and held a note, you would hear that you actually only have 48 dB of dynamic range. But if you have a sound that is dying away, what you have is your noise floor is constantly 48 dB down from wherever you are. So as the sound decays, you're getting even better than 16-bit resolution. Again, if you were to tell a scientist this, or someone who is into the theoretical of how something works, they might say that's a terrible idea. But in practice, it's fantastic. It sounds great. No one can hear it. We would A/B. Here's the sound without that. Here's the sound with it. Compare it. And the bottom line is, sadly, something that's 48 dB below. I mean, imagine if you've got two sounds. If there's truly static, you could hear. But if you had a sound that's 48 dB below, I mean, that's the equivalent of, a fraction of a percent of harmonic distortion,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yep.
So many clever solutions for the limitations of the time. It's always really interesting to hear about these.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Roger Lynn's brilliant solution way back then is he used an 8-bit companding DAC. So he got 72 dB of dynamic range where he should have only gotten 48. So that was a very long-winded answer to your question. But the bottom line is we were not whatever definitions you might use of component modeling, I wouldn't call it what we were doing in the early days was component modeling. I think we were modeling what mattered and having hopefully the good sense to know what mattered and what didn't for what we could do at the time.
Yeah, no, perfect. And look, just as a bit of an experience in regards to the practicality and the differences is that, I revisited those songs probably more than 15 years later, and I'm listening to the guitar tone and I'm thinking, it's not really moving a lot of air. So what I did is that I called up some guitar amp model plugins, modern guitar amp model plugins, and then I applied them to those tracks, but through a clean valve channel as far as the amp, but then I ran it through 2 quad cabinets. And that's what, and then the difference was amazing, Marcus.
Oh, absolutely. That's the cabinets were the weakest part of those early modelers. Yeah.
So there you go. So 15 plus years later, I've called these old tracks up, and my friend had come over for a visit, and I've just said, I'm going to show you something. I said, do you remember those tracks that we did around 99, 2000, those prog metal tracks that you played on? He says, yeah. I said, we were using that kidney bean that you still own. You just literally stole off me, and then we paid for it, actually. And he said, yeah. I went, I'm going to show you something. So I called up the session, and I said, you remember this is the tone? And he's kind of looking at me, he's going, oh. I went, yeah, it's kind of aged a little bit, hasn't it? He said, well, yeah, because he's got not only the pod, but he's got more modern Line 6 stuff as well, more modern guitar tones. And I went, okay, close your eyes for a second. And then I just called up the inserts and flicked on these amp simulators with the cabs. And his eyes just sprung open. He went, what the fuck did you just do there? and I went,
that's great.
Well, here we go. We've moved forward, 15, 16 years. This is the technology now with the amp modeling, and it was just lacking a bit of air. Look at, hear the difference. It was amazing, Marcus. So there you go. And it's actually good that you've actually said, hey, that was probably the weakest point. But when we first heard it, we didn't know what the weakest point was. We just went, wow, this sounds way better than anything else,
If you've ever listened to Glenn at Spectre Sound Studios on YouTube, he goes on and on about, in a good way, about how important the speakers are for the overall tone and presence and everything like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really is.
And I was using multiple guitar amp sims from different companies, and I was using different cabs, and I was using different speakers in the cabs, and I spent hours just sitting there playing around. I was spending way too much time because there's only subtle differences, but I'm going, does it sound better? That's not. And then I got to a point where I'm going, just commit, Vin, commit, because you're going to be here for a month trying to just dial in these new guitar tones. But look, that I thought that was a good story worth sharing. Just that it showed the differences in the modeling technologies in those, that decade and a half between recording and then moving forward. I couldn't do anything with the tone. In hindsight, what I should have done, and we didn't even think about this, was actually split the guitar tone, and we should have recorded
the direct.
Should have recorded a direct as well, because that's what we do now. When we're using guitar amp simulators now, we never commit to the tone. It's always a dry channel, and then we can sit there and flick between the models and stuff. So, but we didn't know that back then. But anyway, I still got something that was a vast improvement from the original recording from pre-2000. So there you go. So
that's great.
The good old kidney bean, that was pretty amazing.
Well, for some people, the models they're really endearing. I think even though we can do, or I should say Line 6 can do, much more sophisticated models today. There's several of the old models that have been ported over to Helix just because there's love for that some of those sounds.
Yeah.
You know, so there's some legacy amp models and legacy effects for when you want those sounds. And of course in the Helix you can put a proper IR cab on it and really make it great.
Yeah. Now with Line 6, so I personally left what we call the brick and mortar retail space in 2001 when I founded my company, my AAVIM Technology.
Congratulations.
Company. Thank you very much. So, I got out of that. I call it the zoo. I mean, we're still in a zoo, a tech zoo, but I mean, that whole frontline retail space, I loved it, but I'd been in there for 10 years and I was just burning out, so I'd had enough. So I hadn't really been staying abreast as much as I would have with the guitar technology stuff because, you know, I was only really open to whatever my friends were using. But I didn't, like looking at the history and just researching the history of Line 6, you guys became the largest guitar amp manufacturer in the world at some point. I mean, that's just astonishing, Marcus.
It was pretty crazy. I mean, there are millions of Line 6 guitar amps and millions of pods out in the world. That's certainly, really didn't imagine it could become so huge. But yeah, we went from it was about 11 years from our launch to making more guitar amps than any other company.
Amazing.
Now, granted, there's some great guitar amp companies out there, and they didn't just let that lie forever. So Line 6 didn't continue to be number one, but has continued to be a very prominent player. And of course, though, a big focus for the last several years have been on really the migration for many guitar players away from even having a guitar amp. So the Helix family of products, it's been a huge focus, and I'm pretty confident Helix today is still by far the most successful family of guitar processors.
Yeah. Well, look, I've the Line 6 launch, that basically created a whole new industry, with all the guitar amp modeling. I mean, there's some incredible companies that are actually doing guitar amp modeling. Everyone's got their own little kind of clique and their own little niche. And it's interesting. I've got, several close friends who have, they got their traditional, valve amps, the big monsters, VHTs and the Soldanos and the so the VHT Pitbull, that's a monster. The Soldanos, as I mentioned, and the Rectifier, all of those, and the Marshalls, they sound incredible. But the practicality of trying to use them in a recording environment at home is just near impossible. But there's a bit of a split. We've got the guys that are absolute purists. So you go see them live, and some of them have got the whole head and quad box and the whole back line, right? And the hair's getting parted because they're standing in front of these quads. They're just getting blasted because they have to get the tone, so they're volume right up. And then I've got other friends that are running, modeled amp solutions with in-ear monitoring and running around the stage, and there's no backline, and the only thing that we're hearing is from the PA. It works for both. I don't get in the middle of the purist versus the modeled stuff. But when you get to a recording environment, you're either going to have a room full of valve amps and speakers, or you can go with the modeled, or you can have a combination. So I think there's room for both. But did you get much pushback from the purists, Marcus? I'd be interested to hear.
Oh yeah, quite a bit. And I think I think there was a lot of there was a misconception for many people about what Line 6 was even about, because we never took the position that there was ever anything wrong with using a tube amp.
Of course.
It was always about, use whatever tools inspire you. And, if you love playing your Tele through a Fender Deluxe and you're happy with your tone, why don't even think about Line 6? You don't have to worry about us.
That's right.
But there were some people that were threatened by the notion, and spend a lot of energy trying to explain why modeling will never be as good as tubes.
Yeah.
That's just, whatever makes you happy is fine with, always been fine with me.
Yeah.
But it's I think in the end, it's a pragmatic solution. Here's an example I can give. As a keyboard player, when I get a chance to play a B3 through a 122 Leslie that's set up well, and sadly I gave mine away back in the late 80s, early 90s, so I don't own one right now. But I know that is going to be such a wonderfully satisfying experience for me, and it's a lot more than just what it sounds like. It's actually, smelling the dust spinning in the Leslie and hearing the grind of the motors and the feel of the keyboard and seeing this visually imposing thing. We listen with all of our senses.
Yes.
We do everything with all of our senses. I mean, sensory transference is a well understood fact, and what we think we hear isn't about just what we hear. It's about all of those things, as well as our emotion and our preconceived notions and everything. So I know I'm going to love playing a Hammond, and I also know that I can be very pragmatic, that if I need to record a Hammond sound, today I have an unbelievable wealth of tools available that can get me an unbelievably amazing sounding Hammond. Right? And it doesn't mean that I don't still love a real Hammond, right? I still love my Yamaha C7 grand piano, but I know I don't have to record that piano if I want a piano sound.
Yeah, of course.
I can if I want. So we always thought of it as and actually I think that's why the pod was so successful, more so in those early days than the amp was. Pod was so different and intentionally designed to visually be so different and everything that it didn't threaten what you used normally. It wasn't saying, I'm here to replace your guitar amp.
Correct, yeah.
It was another tool. And it's just like a MIDI controller keyboard wasn't saying, I'm here to replace your piano, right? I do a different job. And I think that enabled people to be more comfortable with it. But for those that are committed to their classic gear, I'm a kindred spirit. I have a stupidly large collection of classic synthesizers because I'm they do something emotionally for me as well as sonically.
Yeah.
But I'm perfectly happy to use plugins too.
Yep.
And use computer-based products. They, whatever works to help you be creative is fair game.
Yeah. I've got one other quick story about the purist. So actually, we can probably come back when we start, when we do the come full circle with the new Oberheim. But I was recently watching an interview with Devin Townsend, and he was mentioning there's a new guitar tuning mechanism that it auto-tunes the guitar. So out live, you're not sitting there fiddling with it. This thing is actually auto-tuning the guitar. And it tends to work and it's fine. And he was relaying the story how, he was on tour with another band that far more traditional, and they're going, why the hell are you using that? That's, that's going against, traditional guitar playing. And Devin's going, listen, if you don't want to use it, don't use it. I'm finding it practically helpful. I'm still, I'm needing to deliver my performance without having to worry whether the guitars are going in and out of tune. So look, that's fine. If you don't want to use it, don't use it. And he relayed the story that during that whole tour where, everyone in his band that was using this new technology, everyone's in perfect tune, going through, where the other bands, he said it was it was a dogfight. It was just dog shit. The things are in and out of tune all the time. And he just basically relayed, there was no point even discussing it. It was just like, if you don't want to use the technology, why are you getting angry about it? Just use what makes you happy, which is exactly what you've just said. And that's the one thing that that kind of spans across all instruments,
It's true, and it seemed to be so specific with with musicians, it's kind of funny. Can you imagine like going to your friend and saying, why do you drive that car? Why, it's like because it's not the car that you would drive.
Yeah.
It's like you kind of don't care what car your friend drives. They drive whatever they like, and I drive whatever I like, and right, or what brand of TV you're watching or something. Can you imagine like just criticizing your friends for every choice they've made for themselves and all this other rest of the world? It's like, I think if you got something that's working for you and makes you happy, that's all. That should be all that matters. Right?
Yeah.
Every hobby is like that. If there was a washing machine space website out there somewhere, like people would be arguing over which one was best. And
it's a good point. In fact, I'm sure there's plenty of people who argue about cars as well. In that,
no, of course.
Honestly, it's anything where people are passionate. If you're passionate about something, you're probably not spending a lot of time arguing about, what kind of blender you use or something, but or what toothbrush brand you buy.
Don't put it out there, Marcus. Don't put it out there.
Someone will prove me wrong, right?
It's out there.
It's probably out there, but yeah. I mean, look, it's great that musicians are passionate about what they do. I've just, for me personally, I'm really comfortable. I'm thrilled that we have so many tools available, so many brilliant products. I mean, it's unbelievable what's available to us to use, and use whatever it is that inspires you.
And be happy.
And be happy.
Now, let's move on. Line 6 was acquired by Yamaha in 2014, but you stayed on till 2019, I believe. Is that correct, Marcus? Yeah.
That's correct.
Yep.
Yeah, we we had accomplished quite a lot by 2013. I was still very happy doing what I'm doing, and we'd built the company to a pretty significant level. That said, we had raised venture money early on, so it was never a secret that at some point it might make sense to sell the company, because your investors, while our investors were very patient and happy with the company, at some point they'd like to get their money back.
Sure.
And but we actually weren't for sale per se. We'd get approached every year for many years and just say, thank you, but we're really not for sale. But we did get approached by a company in 2013 that will remain nameless, but there was a very serious intention, and they were making a serious overture and had some interesting ideas about what we could do if we joined forces. And it was enough so that our board, myself included, said, well, we should take this seriously. I had some previous relations with some people at Yamaha, and I've always been a huge fan of Yamaha. I have countless Yamaha products over the years, and it's kind of funny. It really was as a courtesy, because I knew people there, that I said, look, I'd confidentially want to let you know that we are seriously looking in discussions with a company and might be selling. And I wanted to let you know, because I wouldn't want you just to be surprised someday if you see an announcement. And, I have no idea if Yamaha would have any interest, but I, just want to give you a heads up. I mean, it actually was that simple. And it, again, yet another time when things happen to converge in my charmed life, I guess. I actually had no idea, but Yamaha, in their last, what they call midterm plan, which they published because they're a public company, they had stated that they believe they want to make some acquisitions, that they want to broaden the innovation capabilities of Yamaha and have more diversity in approach to products. And I think they'd set aside like a $350 million fund to be looking about acquiring people. And so when you combine that, they were looking to acquire companies, and what Line 6 did, when you really look at the product mix, it's almost a perfect complement. That what Line 6 was doing was pretty much all in areas that Yamaha wasn't particularly active in. Yamaha was an early pioneer in guitar modeling. They had the, now I'm going to space on the name, the someone will figure it out for me. They had it was a 2-unit rack that had motorized knobs on it.
Oh, I vaguely remember it.
And it came out around the same time as our first amp. It was very good. So they dabbled in modeling, and they dabbled in guitar amps. They had done a few partnerships and so on. But at the time, they really weren't doing anything much in guitar effects or guitar technology, doing very well with acoustic guitars. And so they were actually very quick to say, we're very interested and let's talk. And we very quickly came to an agreement. And Yamaha, if we were ever to sell, for me personally, Yamaha was always my first choice. I just thought it'd be I think they're a great company, and it'd be really fun to see what things we could do together. So that the deal closed in January of 2014, and they wanted everyone to. It wasn't an acquisition out of necessity, and it certainly wasn't one where the goal was like to just figure out how to consolidate and things like that. They wanted Line 6 to continue as it was, as a standalone entity, and continue to innovate, and then look for ways of how we could partner and grow from there. And so I was very happy to stay on. I wasn't required to stay on. I would say I feel very fortunate that I've never been required to do anything. I've been able to always do what I enjoyed. And so Michel's almost 10 years older than me. He did retire after about the first year, which is something he'd wanted to do. And we, of course, we were very sorry to see him go, but we totally understood. But Sue and I both stayed on, as did everyone else. Well, I mean, a few people did leave, as often happens, and in a transaction like that, there's always going to be some people who they're just anticipating that there could be changes or things they don't like.
Yep.
And they may decide, maybe I should just go do something else. But I would say, by and large, the vast majority of people stayed on, and there's many people still at Line 6 that have been there since the very early days. So I really loved working with Yamaha, and we did a lot of great stuff in those 5 years. We did some collaboration. We created a guitar division, and we acquired Ampeg.
Oh,
and,
right. Okay.
I was general manager of. We actually proposed to Yamaha, and they agreed to change the name of our company. So the company became that's in Calabasas still was changed to Yamaha Guitar Group. So Line 6 once again became a brand, as it was in the beginning, an important brand as part of a group, but it's not a company per se.
Right.
Just like Ampeg is a part of Yamaha Guitar Group, as is Yamaha Guitars.
Yes.
And so when I left, I was general manager of the guitar division for Yamaha, and still have some great friends at Yamaha, and really enjoyed that experience. But also saw that things were functioning really quite well, and that I believe the team could manage just fine without me. And I was, approaching 60 and thinking, well, it might be time to either slow down or have another chapter. So I, discussed it with Yamaha, and we worked through a transition. And the Joe Bentivegna, who was COO, and with Line 6 for 10 years, he took over to run the company, and I stepped aside, and Sue did by the end of 2019 as well. Now, on a personal side, it was, again, we had to chuckle. It was quite fortuitous for us that we didn't have any crystal ball, but we didn't realize within just a few months there'd be this lockdown and a pandemic. So it was. I have to say, I didn't mind not having to be, responsible for a giant division of Yamahas and all those employees through all of that. I'm sorry that everyone had to deal with that, but it was kind of fortuitous for Sue and myself that we were, we shifted into a role of just providing some consulting and guidance for others in the industry, and
Right.
and could just stay at home and work from there, which ended up being what everyone was doing at that
Yes.
point.
Right.
And that moves us to your next chapter.
Oh, hey. So, Vin, because people are going to wonder.
Yep.
That guitar amp you're talking about, that was the Yamaha DG1000. It was a
Thank
red
you.
rack unit with motorized faders or motorized knobs.
There you go. DG, I know DG1000. And it was a great product.
Yep.
And,
Awesome.
But we used to talk with Yamaha and others about it. It shows what happens when, if you have a company that's going to live or die based on the success of a product, you're pretty dedicated to making sure it's going to work. And,
Right. Yeah, definitely.
Yamaha certainly had the capabilities to crush Line 6 in the early days if they had wanted to, but there really wasn't. Yamaha does so many things. There wasn't anyone at Yamaha dedicated to that guitar space with such a passion to make it happen. So you can, follow through the product arc, and you can see that, guitar was, up until we started the guitar division, guitar was never a dedicated division at Yamaha. It was always part of some other group. So whoever was responsible for it was potentially, for a while there was a combo group. So they were responsible for drums and keyboards and guitars all together. So if keyboards are really taking off, it makes sense that division is going to focus a lot of attention to keyboards, and maybe to the detriment of guitars. Whereas
Right.
at Line 6, if we had failed with Pod, we'd just be out of business.
Yeah.
Right? So it's a different level of importance, I guess.
Yeah.
And that's why Line 6, I think, in the end was able to be successful, because we either had to be successful or go out of business. That's how most startups are.
Yeah, you had one focus, where with Yamaha, there's a huge umbrella. So, you're saying, if the division doesn't actually work or a product doesn't work, they'll just write it off and move some resources to the others. I think what we should do now is just move on to your new company. Now, is it pronounced RIG? Is that how you pronounce it? WR, these are capitals, and 2 little I's and a G. RIG. I mean, that's an awesome company name.
It's a strange, funny name. It's it's actually a little acronym, and I'm still partnered with my wife. We've been married over 40 years, and have been working together from even in bands from when we were teenagers.
Wow.
She's
Okay.
a great singer and keyboard player. So her name is Susan Wolf.
Yes.
And that is the W.
Right.
And I'm Marcus Ryle, and that's the R. So it's the Wolf Ryle Innovation Impact Group. And we just thought it was kind of funny to have it, hope that people would see it as pronounced as RIG, because it's just kind of a musical or music-related word.
So there you go. I picked up on the pronunciation. There you go. I got
The
it.
correct pronunciation.
Yep.
But what we're doing is, it's almost like going back to the beginning, but with the benefit of over 4 decades of experience. It's just the two of us. And but instead of we don't want to start another company or things like that. Just like do our own products. But there's a lot of great people out there, and there's a lot of great people that we've known for many years in the industry that we were very happy to just help out and provide some advisement, and on a consulting basis, to learn from our experiences and give advice and guidance on how they can grow their companies and make great products. And so we've been doing that. It's been a lot of fun. We mainly been able to work with people that we've known for a long time and admire. We helped out. That's Dave Smith. I've known since 1978 when he introduced the Prophet 5, and we were, very friendly competitors through the 80s, the Oberheim days, while he was doing sequential. And he was one of the first people that approached us when we started our thing, and he was interested as he had turned 70 to learn more about how we'd sold the company and how that worked. And that's what led to the Sequential and Focusrite
Yes, of course.
merging, and very thankfully led to, me after all these years finally getting a chance to work directly with Dave when we worked together on the OBX8
Yes.
for Oberheim.
Yeah, and quite an amazing collaboration and product between Tom, yourself, Dave, and I forgot the last engineer. I'm sorry.
Well, Tony Karavidas was a
That's
big
the
part
one.
of the hardware engineering. There were a number of other engineers at Sequential, some really brilliant software folks and mechanical design and so on. I mean, what we, the basic story, which I've told before, but in short, Tom Oberheim had lost his name when he went bankrupt in 1985, and so
did Dave.
yes, Dave did as well. You're right, and it was Yamaha that gave it back to him.
Correct.
So it had been my mission for about 10 years. I was on the side trying to figure out a way to get Tom his name back, because it just felt like one of those things that was wrong in the world, and that's a whole long story in and of itself. But by 2021. I was able to get all of Tom's trademarks and logo registrations back to him.
And there's two aspects to that as well, because Gibson owned the rights in certain parts of the world, and I think Behringer owned it in other parts. So that was a two-part return, so to speak. Yeah.
Yeah, it was a little complex process.
I bet.
But it all ended up really wonderful, and Gibson gave the marks to Tom in I think that was in 2020, and then and Behringer gave their marks to Tom in 21.
Yep.
Or maybe it was Gibson might have been 2019. I don't know. I don't remember. Somewhere around there.
Yep.
In any case, we got the marks back, and as I mentioned, Tom's 86. He's still very passionate about synthesizers, but that's not typically the age you reboot your company.
Correct.
So since he and Dave, they'd been longtime friends, and they collaborated on the OB6 7 years ago or so, it just seemed natural. And Dave, of course, had relaunched the Prophet 5 to great success. So Dave was like, maybe it's time to do a proper Oberheim. And so that it was a real labor of love, and I think it really did turn out fantastic.
The OBX8, absolutely astonishing instrument, Marcus. I mean,
thank you.
I think it's worth actually just giving us the listeners a bit of detail on the technology that's actually involved there, because is it 3 synthesizers, complete synthesizers in there, or is there 4?
You could almost argue it's like 4.5.
Well, boy,
it's. I mean, what's mainly focused on, of course, are the 3 big versions of the OB, the OBX, OBXA, and OB8. It has 100% of the capabilities of all those, and it's a pure analog signal path. The signal does not get digitized at any step of the way. It is authentic analog design based on the original circuitry. But it also encompasses the OBSX, which is a lesser known preset machine that came out between the OBX and OBXA. Its voice board was just kind of a halfway between. It used Curtis chips, but it still had the X-Mod feature of the OBX and so on. So we can do all of that. And we also threw in, it was actually Tony's clever handiwork on the hardware. He threw in the additional filter modes that are in the original Oberheim SEM,
right?
Which the OBX filter is based on that same filter, but on the OBX you only get the low pass. In the OBX8 we threw in the band pass, high pass, and notch filters. So it does almost everything an SEM can do. There's really just very little it can't. That's kind of the half, I guess you could say.
Right.
And it does everything an OBX, OBSX, OBXA, and OB8 can do. And it has all of the factory presets from those original synths because every one of those parameters is directly available on the OBX8. So it can do all the original presets.
Really nice.
Yeah, I watched several of your videos where you're in your studio.
Oh, my comparison videos?
Yeah, and you had your original OBX8 and the OBX8, and you had the same patch, and then you were using left and right hand, you're swapping it, and I'm thinking, wow, I mean, you can't get any closer than that. So, and again, I'm listening to it via a digital format, streaming from the web. But I have a friend here in Melbourne that actually has one of these units.
Oh, great.
He actually works for Focusrite, so he's a very lucky man to have probably received the first one into the country. So, and I've got one question there. Is so with Oberheim, obviously all of the development and the engineering was done with the Focusrite team, or the sequential team under the Focusrite banner.
Yeah, the way to think of it is the sequential team. Sequential is still the same company it was.
Yes.
From a legal entity standpoint, obviously not the same company in that, the tragic loss of Dave.
Dave, yeah, of course.
That's significant from any context. But Sequential is owned by Focusrite.
Yes.
But the team developing the OBX8 is much like it's just, many of the same people who helped develop the Prophet 5 Rev 4.
Yes.
And the main difference was they had, and Dave himself, of course, was deeply involved. The difference was that where with the Prophet 5, they had such intimate knowledge of the history of Prophet, because that's what they've all lived. The Oberheim world, it was not an issue for them technically, but Tony certainly had some experience with Oberheim, but most of them, Oberheim had always been the competitor. So the role for me and for Tom was to ensure that we were making a real Oberheim. Sometimes that got down to very obscure, minute details, but I think those are the things that really matter. And so it took quite a bit. Probably took more time than anyone expected, and a lot more detail and hard work. But I think it really paid off.
Well, the proof's in the pudding, isn't it, Marcus? The end result is quite amazing. Now, is Oberheim under the Focusrite / sequential banner, the umbrella, or is it? Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Essentially, I mean, the way to look at it is, I mean, what made the most sense is to just structure things so that's it's however you want to look at it. It's an exclusive relationship. Tom is still involved.
Yes.
And, it's actually quite gratifying for me to see that at 86, after, many years where he was doing other things and where he always had the love for synthesizers, but I think he maybe never imagined he'd be able to have this kind of victory lap at this stage and to be involved in this stuff again. So what's so wonderful is that Sequential and Focusrite, Sequential, basically, Tom doesn't have to worry at all about the business. In fact, you think all the way back to he started this great company with great products and great brand, and the business, the issue of managing a business is where things got into trouble.
Yeah.
Now he can just he's involved with what he loves, was synthesizers, and but he doesn't even have to think about the business side. That's a great freedom. What a wonderful thing, right? And the Focusrite team, they're all so passionate about what these brands mean and everything. And the Sequential folks, obviously, the loss of Dave is unimaginable, but it is really remarkable what Dave did. Such a good job of hiring such a great team of talented people, and had structured things in a way that it was quite fortuitous. I mean, we all know intellectually that none of us are here forever. I know that Dave, we all believe Dave would be with us for quite a bit longer. But it's fortuitous that he was able to put things in place so that his legacy can really carry forward, even though he's not here.
Yeah. And look, you've come back full circle as well. I mean, your first job was at Oberheim and OBXA. And
isn't that funny?
OBXA and OB8. and you've just basically, a kid in a candy store. You've come full circle.
It's the
and
same thing again.
Yeah, you've been asked to basically re-engineer the whole lot again, which is a fantastic thing.
I feel really fortunate. It really is exciting. And, I owe Tom a lot. He hired this just turned 19-year-old kid. He saw something in me that he thought could just be, given the keys to the car and start driving. I mean, it's pretty remarkable. That was a huge opportunity for me and great education. And it's really gratifying to be able to have helped bring Oberheim back now.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, a little bit of you've repaid the respect and the opportunity that he gave you, that you've come back and helped him resurrect the brand, which is incredible.
Exactly.
Hey, now I've only got one last question for you.
Okay.
And just, if you have any thoughts on the current landscape with where music technology is in general at the moment, and where it could be possibly moving in the future. I know that's a pretty broad type of question.
It is. And, I don't know if my answer will be very satisfying, but I think at any given time, it kind of always feels like we must have done everything, that we have all the tools, we can do so much, but invariably things just continue to evolve and innovation continues forward. I've been asked questions like that through my 4 decades of making products.
Yeah, of course.
And all we have to do is kind of look back and go, imagine really where we were at 40 years ago in music technology. I see no reason why we won't continue to evolve. And 40 years from now, we'll be going, wow, boy, it sure was archaic. It's like, boy, you remember when it was impossible to hook up our Dante systems?
Yeah.
or whatever else we might be thinking,
Yeah.
Right? It's like, oh, remember when we actually had to, we couldn't just think our musical ideas or whatever it might be. There's the runway is infinite.
Yeah,
and we just we'll keep innovating along.
Yep.
That's what makes it fun.
Yep, and I think with all of the advances in AI, and that's a whole other show. I'll tell you what, maybe that could be,
that's for sure.
That could be our second comeback show, Marcus. We can talk about come back in a few years and see if AI has wreaked any havoc. Oh boy,
exactly. I'm sure it will.
Yeah. Hey, look, you know what, guys? That has been incredible.
Absolutely.
Thank you very, very much, Marcus.
My pleasure.
Now, can you hear this? That's me crossing you off my bucket list.
Oh, look at that!
Because you're on you are one of the guests on my bucket list, and so
you're very kind.
I've just successfully crossed that off. That has been an awesome show, and I think that is a good place to end it. And you are more than welcome to come back at any time. And I
appreciate it. And
thank you again, Pete, for being the co-pilot once again. I think that's where we're going to end it. On to the next.